It was a typical call for a simple repair, nothing unusual at first. I hadn't given much attention to it. I was 60 and lived alone in a tranquil, familiar environment. I had been unaffected by the rush of desire for longer than I liked to admit until that Wednesday afternoon when James walked through my door young, powerful, and full of nervous appeal. I sensed a change inside me. What began as an innocent moment quickly escalated into something considerably more frightening. Our professional interactions became tense, and when I crossed boundaries, I was unaware of the distinction between need and obsession becoming blurred. I hadn't planned for it, nor did I anticipate it, but it had awoken something in me that I couldn't ignore. I'd been looking at the leaking sink for days, watching the water build in the basin, a continuous reminder of how little I paid attention to my surroundings. After years of meticulously selected house renovations, everything felt worthless without someone to share it with. Following my divorce, the home had grown to large, with each room booming with memories. I tried not to worry about the kitchen, which had once been the heart of our family life, but had fallen into silent decay much like me. However, when the sink leak became too much to ignore, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I asked for assistance. I discovered James, a local handyman. The name held no significance to me. I merely required someone to execute the task. When I answered the door that chilly Wednesday afternoon, I expected to see a grizzled old guy experienced and perhaps a little rough around the edges. But instead, I saw a young man in his 20s. James was there, towering above me, a toolbox in hand, and a plain gray shirt draped across his massive chest. He had a timid smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, yet something about him drew me in right away. He remarked, "Hi, I'm here to look at the sink." His voice was deep yet soothing. I blinked, taken aback by the slight twitch of my heart in my chest. At my age, I expected those small sparks to fade away, but here they were, a flicker of something I hadn't experienced in years. I managed to say this while standing aside to let him inside the house. I watched him move around the area, his eyes surveying the kitchen with silent attention. He worked efficiently, crouching down to check the sink and deftly sliding his hands over the pipe. I found myself staying close, unwilling to look away. I stood near the kitchen island, pretending to be preoccupied with something else, but my gaze never left his. There was something about the way he moved, the strength in his arms as he tightened the bowls beneath the sink, and the calm concentration on his face. I hadn't been this close to a young guy in years. I hadn't really considered what it might be like until now. I couldn't put it into words, but something inside me stirred. It wasn't simply his appearance. James was obviously handsome in his gruff, effortless way. No, it was the energy he brought into the room, a liveliness that stood in stark contrast to the stillness that had crept over my life. He had a warmth about him that I hadn't felt in a long time. For a minute, I found myself leaning against the counter, watching him too closely. I adjusted my robe, which I had never thought provocative until now, and stood up, attempting to shake the foolish notions that were coming into my head. James looked up from his job, grabbing my attention. I could see a flicker of surprise in his countenance as he briefly glanced over me before returning to the sink. His cheeks flushed slightly, and I couldn't help but feel a tiny thrill at the reaction. It seemed simple enough, but I felt a stirring within that I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Desire. I went over to where he was. He appeared attentive, kneeling and observing as he worked, but the way his hands moved suggested a hint of anxiety. It seemed as though he was making an effort to minimize my presence. "Is everything going well down there?" I inquired, my tone gentler than I intended. He nodded without looking up. "Yeah, we should be able to fix a small leak in a matter of minutes." Unable to resist, I reached out and gently squeezed his shoulder, causing his body to tighten. His body tightened under my fingers, and I experienced the surge of power that comes from knowing I had influenced him. It was a feeling I hadn't had in years, and I wasn't ready to let go just yet. "You're really strong," I replied, my voice becoming somewhat flirty. He looked up at me, surprised, his cheeks blushing even more. Uh, thank you. I smiled at him a kind, knowing grin. I could feel the tension between us increasing, thickening the air in my little kitchen. Though unsaid, the tension was undeniable. He shuffled uneasily, evidently attempting to maintain professionalism. But the way his hands trembled slightly as he tightened the final bolt told me all I needed to know. I took a step closer, leaning over the counter, watching his every move. He stood up, wiping his hands on a cloth, and I could see him avoiding my look now, attempting to keep his composure. "Do you require any assistance?" I asked, knowing full well that he didn't. He shook his head hurriedly. I reached out again while he was packing up his equipment, but his hands were trembling this time. I let my fingers brush over his arm, feeling the warmth of his flesh under my touch. He paused for a second, and I could see the internal conflict in his eyes. I could tell he wanted to give in, but he also knew better. He was younger, and I, as a woman, should have known better, but it didn't matter. In that moment, as I placed my palm on his arm, I sensed the tension between us pulsing like electricity. He gazed at me with weak breath and big, anxious eyes. For a while, I thought he was going to stride forward and narrow the gap between us, but then he stepped back, shattering the spell. "Ma'am," he said, his voice trembling, "I am only here to mend the sink." I smiled softly, amused by how nervous he seemed. "Are you certain there are no other issues that require attention?" I inquired, my voice mocking. His hands were quivering as he grabbed the remainder of his equipment, and I could tell he was struggling to maintain control. I moved closer, my lips only inches from his. "There's something more you could do for me," I said quietly and suggestively. He did not answer. He simply gazed at me, locked in place. I leaned in, as if I were ready to kiss him again, but before I could, he made a sudden step back, his hands up in front of him as if to deter me. "I can't," he said, shaking his head. I pouted, unhappy, but I knew he was not going to give in just yet. Anyway, he departed quickly, virtually sprinting out of the home, leaving me standing in the kitchen alone. However, there was something unique about his departure. It wasn't just the discomfort. There was a tension in the air, something unfinished, unsolved, and I knew deep down that James had said no. Not because he wasn't interested, but because he couldn't trust himself not to say yes. The days that followed were not a combination of enthusiasm and frustration. I couldn't stop thinking about James and how he had hesitated, how his gaze had lingered on me just a little too much. It had been years since I felt this way or any emotion at all. And now there was this young man who had aroused something inside me that I thought had died a long time ago. I did not expect to see him again. I assumed he had persuaded himself he wouldn't or couldn't come back. But about a week later, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but when I responded, it said, "Hello, hello. This is James, the plumber. I was simply phoning to make sure everything was okay with the sink." As the fix held up, his tone was pleasant. Even though his tone was professional, I could sense the underlying tremor. He seemed nervous, which excited me more than I wanted to admit. I answered in a casual tone, knowing exactly where this was going. "Funny you should ask. The sink is good, but I was hoping you could check into another issue in the bathroom. It's probably nothing, it might not be significant, but I wouldn't feel comfortable until a professional had inspected it." There was a pause at the other end of the line. I could hear him evaluating his choices and debating if he should return. He finally responded, "I can get there in about an hour." When I hung up, I couldn't help but smile at myself. This time, I had no intention of letting him go so lightly. When James came, he was noticeably more apprehensive than the last time. He attempted to keep his normal calm, professional approach, but I could feel the tightness in his shoulders and the way he avoided my look as I escorted him upstairs to the restroom. The problem with the faucet was small, simply a loose handle, but I knew it wasn't the faucet that had drawn him back. As he worked, I stood close, silently observing him. The air between us was dense with unsaid tension that made my skin quiver. He was more focused this time, with his head down and his gaze fixed on the task at hand. But I could tell he was more aware of me and the gap between us. I couldn't resist any longer. "James," I whispered quietly, taking a step closer. "I've been thinking about it." He hesitated briefly, his hand tightening over the faucet. He didn't glance up, but I noticed his knuckles turning white and his respiration quickening slightly. He spoke in a guarded tone, seemingly uncertain about admitting what had happened previously. I couldn't shake the memory of the last time. I proceeded in a quiet, personal voice. "You were interested, but you held back. Why did it happen?" He did not respond at first. His hands were still working on the faucet, but I could see the tension in his eyes. "It's only that I'm a professional," he explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wouldn't be correct, would it?" I questioned, going closer. I could feel the heat emanating from him. "Who determines what is good or wrong, James? You are a mature man, and I am a grown woman. We both know there's something between us. You can feel it, right?" He glanced at me, clenched his jaw, and his eyes filled with the same turmoil as the last time. He struggled. I could see it. He was making a concerted effort to maintain a professional demeanor and maintain a barrier between us, but the tension had already escalated to a critical level, and I refused to let it go now. I let my palm brush over his chest, feeling his heart race. His breathing hitched beneath my fingertips, and for a brief minute, I thought he'd step aside, but then, unexpectedly, he reached out and grasped my arm, dragging me closer to him. It was not scratchy, but it was solid. His face was inches from mine, and his breath was warm. He whispered against my skin, "Elizabeth," with a low and strong voice, "this is not a game." I never said it was. I responded, my lips curling into a grin. There was no turning back now. James's hands were still on my arm, firm yet reluctant, as if he didn't trust himself to let go. His countenance was raw and unprotected now. He no longer displayed the anxious politeness he had demonstrated before, locking his gaze on mine, and I could feel the tension between us change into something deeper, far more threatening. I moved in closer, my lips hovering just millimeters away from his. His hold tightened slightly, as if he was trying to keep me close but also pushing me away. For a brief moment, I worried he'd break down and walk out the door, never to return. But his breathing increased, and I knew he was feeling the same way I was. "Sometimes you just have to let go," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but filled with an unmistakable promise. And James hesitated for one more beat. Then, as if a sudden force surged within him, he drew me nearer and planted a kiss on my lips, a kiss that carried the weight of everything we had been suppressing. His lips moved against mine with a kind of urgency that sent a shiver down my spine, his hands gripping my waist as if he were afraid to let go. We pulled apart just enough to regain our breath, our foreheads resting on each other, our breathing rapid and irregular. I could feel his heart thumping against his chest, his pulse. The expression in his eyes told me all I needed to know. This wasn't just a moment of weakness for him, it was something he'd been fighting for a long time, but didn't want to accept. "What's next for us?" he inquired, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze seeking mine for answers. I smiled and took a small step back to give him some room. I could feel the pull between us, the unmistakable connection that had led us this far. "I believe you know the answer to that, James," I murmured gently, my voice filled with a calm certainty I hadn't experienced in years. "We have already crossed the boundary. Why quit now?" For a minute, he didn't say anything. He simply stood there, staring at me, the conflict still flickering in his eyes. But then, with one final glance at the door, he reached for me again, his hands returning to my waist and dragging me closer. There was no uncertainty or hesitation this time. We knew precisely what we were doing. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. James and I barely made it out of the restroom, our tension finally releasing in a way that seemed both unavoidable and exciting. His hands were everywhere, his touch on my shoulders, waist, and his was forceful yet courteous, as if he was letting go of power while maintaining some sort of restraint. But right now, I didn't want to be constrained. I hadn't felt this way in years, not since before the divorce. For so long, my life had been filled with routine dinners alone, peaceful nights in front of the television, and the odd phone call from my adult children. I had no idea how much I had been desiring this or how much I needed to feel loved again and desired. James kissed me passionately, his lips going down my neck and his hands sliding down to grab my hips. I let out a small cry and my head dropped back as I surrendered. There was something addictive about being with him this young, muscular man who appeared to perceive me in a way that no one else had in a long time. It was more than simply physical attraction. It was a deeper connection, which none of us expected but couldn't deny. We eventually made it to the bedroom, and the air between us was electrified with an energy I hadn't felt in years. As we lay together, tangled in the covers, I couldn't help but smile to myself, feeling more alive than I had in what seemed like ages. "I've never done anything like this before," James whispered, his voice low and hoarse as he lay alongside me, his fingertips tracing languid circles on my arm. "Neither have I admitted, my voice equally faint. He turned to look at me, and his countenance revealed something unexpected vulnerability. "I should not have," he said, shaking his head slightly. "But I don't regret it." I pressed my palm against his chest, felt his heartbeat beneath my fingertips, and smiled quietly. After that, none of us lay in silence for long, each immersed in his own thoughts. The weight of our recent events hovered between us, yet it didn't feel uncomfortable. It was like we had crossed a boundary we didn't know existed and didn't want to return. Eventually, James got up and looked at the clock. "I should go," he responded, with a reluctance that echoed mine. "I've been here longer than I expected." "You don't have to," I explained, though I knew he could not remain. He hesitated, staring at me as if he wanted to stay, and then shook his head. "I don't want things to be awkward," he replied quietly but firmly. I grinned, realizing what he meant. "I don't," I said, sitting up alongside him. "You are a decent man." "James, we both needed it, and I'm pleased it occurred." But I didn't anticipate anything more. Although he appeared relieved, a hint of confusion lingered in his eyes, as if he wasn't accustomed to such simplicity, indicating that everything was perfectly okay with no strange sensations or anything else. I chuckled quietly and shook my head. "No, James, I didn't experience any unusual feelings. It was simply one of those moments, no attachments, no pressure." He nodded slowly, as if he were still trying to process the simplicity of it all. "Okay," he said after a long pause. "I guess I'll see you around." "Maybe," I said, teasing him just a little. "If my sink breaks again, you'll be the first one I call." That made him smile, and he stood up, grabbing his tools and slinging his bag over his shoulder. But before he left, he turned back to me one last time. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice soft but filled with sincerity, "I don't regret it. I just want you to know." As he opened the door, I smiled. "I don't regret it either." And in an instant, he disappeared. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about James more than I should have. Every time I walked past the sink, I remembered the way he had looked at me, the way his hands had trembled. I recollected the warmth of his kiss, the way his body had pressed against mine, the way he had hesitated, then finally given in when I touched his arm slightly. It had been so long since I had experienced such feelings. I hadn't anticipated him calling again. I figured he had probably convinced himself it was a one-time thing, and it shouldn't happen again. Perhaps he was correct. Perhaps it shouldn't have occurred in the first place. But I didn't harbor any regrets. Even though I wasn't certain I'd ever see him again, I wasn't even sure if I wanted to. The part of me that felt alive in his arms didn't care. I knew that if he called, I wouldn't say no. And then, one afternoon, about a week after he had left, my phone rang. As soon as I saw his name flash on my phone screen, my heart pounded. I wasn't expecting or hoping for it, but there it was, his name, his number, a return to the thrill of what we'd shared. Hey. His voice was tentative, cautious, like he wasn't sure if he should be calling. I wanted to check on the faucet. Make sure everything's still working fine. There was a pause, and I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, as though he was trying to convince himself that this was still just a professional call. But we both knew better. The faucet is fine, I replied, letting my voice drop just slightly enough to let him know that I wasn't talking about the sink. But there's another issue you might be able to help me with. Another pause. I could almost hear his heartbeat quickening on the other end of the line of hesitation that told me he was weighing his options, deciding whether or not he should come back. I'll be there in an hour, James said, his voice barely above a whisper, like he was unsure of the decision he had just made. But I knew, deep down, that once again, he couldn't stay away any more than I could resist asking him back. When I hung up the phone, a wave of anticipation washed over me. It had been a long time since I felt this kind of excitement, a mixture of nervous energy and raw desire coursing through me like a current. I told myself it was just a momentary indulgence, nothing serious, nothing lasting, but the truth was it had already become more than that. I spent the next hour pacing around the house. I devoted the next hour to organizing unnecessary items, attempting to soothe the mounting excitement within me. This wasn't like me. With James, all the carefully constructed walls I'd built over the years seemed to crumble upon his arrival. I experienced the same exhilaration once more. He stood in the doorway, hesitant but clearly drawn to the pool between us. His eyes met mine, and I saw the same flicker of uncertainty that had been there the last time. But there was something else to something darker, more intense. He stepped inside, and I could feel the electricity between us grow. We didn't say much as I led him to the bathroom, pretending that I had some small issue that needed fixing, but we both knew why he was really there. As soon as we were alone in the bathroom, the air between us shifted. James tried to focus on the task at hand, his hands fiddling with the faucet, but I could see the way his fingers trembled slightly. He was nervous, but so was I. How much I wanted this made me nervous more than what we were doing. I stepped closer, watching as he pretended to inspect the faucet, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the task. The silence between us was heavy, thick with unspoken desire. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I reached out, placing my hand lightly on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his skin through his shirt. James froze under my touch, his entire body going rigid. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't even breathe. But then, slowly, he turned to face me, his eyes filled with the same conflict I had seen. I whispered to James, my voice soft yet insistent, "You don't have to pretend." His breath hitched, and for a moment, I thought he might pull away again, just like the last time. However, something shifted in him. His expression changed, his resolve broke. His defenses crumbled, and without another word, he pulled me into his arms, his lips crashing against mine. He pulled me into his arms with a force that left me breathless. It was different this time. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. This time, James wasn't holding back. His hands roamed over my body, his touch filled with a kind of urgency that sent shivers down my spine. I kissed him back, my fingers tingling in his hair as I pressed myself closer to him, losing myself in the intensity of the moment. We didn't stop this time. We did not pause. The bathroom felt too small, too confined, without breaking the kiss. James lifted me up and carried me to the bedroom, where the boundaries between us completely disappeared. The hours that followed were a blur of sensation and emotion, the world outside fading away as we gave in to the desire we had both tried so hard to ignore. James's hands moved over my body with a kind of reverence, a need that matched my own. In those moments, nothing else mattered. I felt more alive than I had in years. It was as if the years had melted away, and I was no longer the woman who had spent so much of her life wrapped in routine. In the quiet loneliness of a big empty house, with James, I felt wanted, desired. We had no shame or guilt, just heat and the understanding we needed. James's touch was both tender and demanding, a mixture of control and release. His lips explored mine with a passion that made my heart race. As he kissed me, I kissed him back with equal fervor, pulling him closer, unwilling to let the moment slip away. As we lay tangled together afterward, our bodies spent, the silence between us was comforting rather than awkward. I could feel James's breath on my neck, slow and steady as his fingers absent-mindedly traced patterns on my skin. I closed my eyes, savoring the warmth of his body next to mine, the weight of his presence. Neither of us spoke for a long time. There was no need for words. We both knew what had just happened was more than just a fleeting moment of passion. It was something deeper, something that neither of us had expected but couldn't deny. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen, not as a 60-year-old woman. No one saw me as someone's former spouse, but as an individual, a woman capable of experiencing the yearning to live. However, despite my best efforts to suppress it, reality persistently surfaced. As the hours passed, I began to feel the weight of what had happened settling over me. James was significantly younger than me, yet the disparity in age didn't seem to hold any significance in the midst of the moment. I realized I couldn't ignore it forever. I glanced over at James, who was still lying beside me, his eyes closed. His breathing was even and peaceful. He looked content, but I wondered how long that contentment would last. How long before he realized the complications of what we were doing? How long before he started to pull away? The thought of it sent a pang of fear through me. I hadn't planned for this. I hadn't planned to feel anything more than a passing attraction. But now, lying here beside him, I knew it was more than that. I had grown attached to him, more attached than I had ever intended. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake him, and wrapped the blanket around myself. I stared out the window, watching as the last rays of the afternoon sun disappeared behind the trees, leaving the room bathed in a soft golden light. The rational part of me knew this couldn't last. Even though I knew this was temporary, and everything we shared was fleeting, I hadn't acknowledged one part of me until now. This part wanted it to last, wanted James to stay, and that terrified me. The days that followed were filled with a strange mixture of longing and uncertainty. James and I continued to see each other, but something had changed. He was still kind, still attentive, but there was a distance between us now, an unspoken tension that neither of us could ignore. James was unintentionally holding on to what we had, which caused his conflicting eyes every time we were together. He was young, with his whole life ahead of him, and I couldn't help but wonder if he had started to regret the path we had taken. The age gap, once a thrilling taboo, now seemed to loom over us like a shadow. I could see the way people looked at us when we were out in public, the curious glances, the judgmental stares. It didn't matter that I felt younger when I was with James. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. To the outside world, we were something unnatural, something that didn't fit, and slowly, I began to feel the weight of that judgment. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, James reached for my hand. His touch was soothing, but his eyes made my heart sink. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice hesitant, as though he wasn't sure how to begin. "About us." I felt a lump form in my throat, but I nodded, urging him to continue. "This is complicated, Elizabeth," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I don't regret anything, but I don't know how to make this work." I knew what he meant. I had been dreading this conversation, but I knew it was inevitable. We had crossed a line, and now we were both struggling to figure out where we stood. "You don't have to explain," I said, my voice calm, even though my heart was racing. I know this is difficult. James looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness that I hadn't expected. He said, I don't want to hurt you, but I can't keep pretending that this is normal. His words struck me deeply. However, I forced myself to maintain my composure. I had known this was coming. Although I was aware that our relationship was fragile and wouldn't endure forever, the unraveling of that conversation didn't alleviate the situation. Even though we continued to see each other, the simple intimacy we once shared had vanished, replaced by an awkwardness neither of us could shake. I sensed James gradually withdrawing despite his efforts to avoid it. I didn't want to admit it, but I was afraid of losing him, afraid of going back to the life I had before, the quiet loneliness of my house, the empty days that stretched out in front of me. It all seemed unbearable now, after everything I had felt with James. One evening, I sat alone in the living room, staring at my phone, willing it to ring. James had promised to visit that afternoon, but hours had passed with no sign of him. I felt a knot of anxiety forming in my chest. He was pulling away, and I didn't know how to stop it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my phone buzzed. It was a text from James. I'm sorry. I can't make it tonight. I need some time to think. I stared at the message, my heart sinking. I knew this was coming, but seeing it in black and white strengthened it. I didn't respond. I didn't know how. Instead, I sat there in the dark, the quiet of the house pressing in on me. A hollow emptiness replaced the thrill that had once filled me, like a weight I couldn't escape. I initially believed that this was merely a temporary affair intended to provide me with a sense of vitality before we both transitioned on. But I had since developed feelings for him. Now, I found myself bearing the consequences. A week passed, and James didn't call. I tried to keep myself busy, filling my days with tasks that didn't really matter. But the emptiness followed me everywhere. I couldn't shake the feeling. I felt as if our shared experience was ending, and I could do nothing to stop it. I tried to stop it, but one evening, just as the sun was setting, my phone rang. It was James. Can I come over? He asked, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. Of course, I replied, though I already knew what was coming. A new tension emerged when he arrived. He looked tired, as though he hadn't slept in days, and I could see the conflict etched in every line of his face as we sat down in the living room. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken words. I waited for him to speak, but he seemed to be struggling with what to say. Elizabeth, he began, his voice soft. I've been doing a lot of thinking. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I care about you, he continued, his eyes locking onto mine, more than I ever thought I would. But I can't keep doing this. I can't pretend that the age difference doesn't matter. I can't pretend that this isn't complicated. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I forced them back, determined to stay composed. I had known this was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. I understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. James looked at me, his expression filled with regret. I don't want to hurt you, Elizabeth, but I think it's best if we end this now before it gets even more complicated. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. I had known all along. James reached for my hand, squeezing it gently, knowing that this couldn't last. His touch was gentle, as if attempting to comfort me in a moment that provided little solace. It was warm and familiar, yet it felt distant, like a reminder of something that was slipping away. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't want it to escalate to this point, but I'm unsure of how to proceed. I looked at him, my heart breaking, with a quiet sigh in my chest. I realized that he was correct. We had stepped over a boundary that had initially been thrilling. But now, the weight of our age difference, the secrecy, and the uncertainty of our future path was overwhelming, and we both knew it. I don't regret anything, I said softly. My voice remained steady despite the lump in my throat. James's eyes softened, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of hesitation, as if he was reconsidering his decision, but it vanished just as quickly. "I don't either," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't keep pretending that this is something it's not." I nodded, knowing that there was nothing more to say. We had shared something real, something beautiful, but it wasn't meant to last. And that was the hardest part of all, accepting that some things, no matter how powerful they feel in the moment, aren't meant to be forever. For a few moments, we just sat there in silence, his hand still wrapped around mine. We appeared to be grasping the final remnants of our possessions, fully aware that they were rapidly diminishing. Finally, James stood up, his movement slow and deliberate, as if he were giving himself time to process what was happening. He then glanced around the room. He looked around the room, seemingly committing it to memory before turning his gaze back to me. "Take care of yourself, Elizabeth," he said quietly. "You too, James," I replied, my voice calm but filled with the weight of everything we weren't saying. He lingered for a moment longer, then he turned and walked toward the door. I watched him go, my heart aching in a way I hadn't expected. Suddenly, the door softly closed behind him, marking his departure. The house felt impossibly quiet after he left, the silence pressing in on me like a heavy fog. It was over. I stared at the door for a long time, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, the thrill, the connection, the passion. I stood up slowly, my body heavy with exhaustion, and made my way to the bedroom. The bed felt too big, too empty without him beside me, and as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't help but wonder if I had made a mistake. Had I let myself fall too far? Had I allowed myself to feel too much? But even as the sadness washed over me, I knew that I wouldn't change a thing. What I had shared with James had awakened something in me, something I hadn't felt in years. It reminded me that I was still capable of desire, of passion, of living, and for that, I would always be grateful. The days that followed seemed to pass slowly, with the quiet routines of my life returning, the same familiar patterns, the same empty spaces. Yet, something had changed. Despite James's departure, the spark he had rekindled within me continued to flicker, refusing to completely fade away. I found myself thinking about him often. I wondered what he was doing and how he was feeling. I knew that ending things had been the right decision for both of us, but that didn't make the longing disappear. It lingered in the background, a quiet ache that I couldn't quite shake. I tried to distract myself with small tasks, cleaning the house, organizing my bookshelves, taking long walks around the neighborhood, but no matter what I did, the memories of James lingered in the corners of my mind, teasing me with the possibility of what it could have been. One afternoon, as I was sorting through some old photo albums, I came across a picture of myself from years ago, young, vibrant, and full of life. I stared at it for a long time, trying to reconcile the woman in the photo with the woman I had become. I had dedicated numerous years to conforming to societal expectations, being a decent wife, a decent mother, and a responsible adult, but in the process, I had forfeited a significant aspect of my identity. James reminded me of the part of me that yearned for adventure, connection, and something beyond mere routine. And despite the end of our relationship, I couldn't resist feeling thankful for the time we spent together. He had given me something I hadn't realized I needed, a reminder that I was still alive, still capable of feeling. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the ache of missing James began to fade. It didn't disappear completely. There were still moments when I thought of him, when I felt that familiar tug of longing, but those moments became less frequent, and the emptiness in my heart began to fill with something else, acceptance. I knew now that our relationship had been a temporary reprieve from the monotony of my life, a brief but intense connection that had brought me back to myself. And while it hadn't lasted, it had served its purpose. I had changed. I could sense a shift in my demeanor as the quiet loneliness that once pervaded my house no longer felt as oppressive. I reclaimed my space and made it mine again. I started reconnecting with old friends, reaching out to people I hadn't spoken to in years. I joined a local book club, something I had always wanted to do, but never made the time for. I took up painting, filling my afternoons with splashes of color and creativity that brought me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. And through it all, I kept the memory of James tucked away in a quiet corner of my heart. I didn't dwell on it, but I didn't push it away either. It was a part of my story, now a chapter that had helped shape the person I was becoming. One evening, months after James had left, I found myself sitting on the back porch with a glass of wine in hand. As the sun sank below the horizon, the sky took on hues of pink and gold, while the air remained cool and crisp, heralding the arrival of autumn. As I sat there, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. I was content. Not just with the quiet, solitary life I had rebuilt for myself, but with the knowledge that I had lived, that I had allowed myself to feel something real, even if it hadn't lasted. James had come into my life unexpectedly, and just as unforeseen, he had left. But the mark he had left on me remained. He had reminded me that life doesn't have to follow a prescribed path, and that sometimes the greatest experiences come from the most unexpected places. I took a sip of my wine, smiling to myself as I thought about the future. It was uncertain, of course. I didn't know what lay ahead. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. I had rediscovered a part of myself that I had previously believed to be forever lost, and that was sufficient. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood up and made my way inside. The house, which once felt cold and empty, now felt warm and welcoming as I closed the door behind me. I couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of hope for whatever lay ahead. I knew I could face it because I had already faced the hardest part, letting go.